All right, here's section 3. And so, how do you slow it? How do you change it? How do we solve this problem? Well, dealing with climate change isn't easy. We're talking about climate. We're talking about the globe here. So it's a global problem, and so it makes it hard to fix. The effects of it will last a long time, even if we change what we do right now. It's got a lot of political issues that go along with it. The harmful and beneficial impacts on the climate are not spread evenly. Some people suffer more than other people, and that creates some problems. And then many of the ways to reduce it are controversial to people. They affect people's economics and their lifestyle, which is something that you don't want to do if you want to create change in the world. And so, what are our options then? Well, one of our options is migration. Or mitigation, mitigation, I don't know what to say, migration. Mitigation, which means to decrease or reduce the amount of something, right? And so we can reduce the amount of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere by using more energy efficient stuff. Okay, we can reduce global warming mainly by reducing greenhouse gas emissions is the main one. Or the other approach besides mitigation is adaptation. We can just simply adapt to this changing environment and change the way we do things to suit this new world we live in. And so with that, what are some of these solutions? Well, prevention-wise, cut your fossil fuels, especially coal. Shift from coal to natural gas would be one way to do that. Improve your energy efficiency. Shift to renewable energies. Make energy efficient and renewable energies part of developing countries. Reduce deforestation. Limit urban sprawl. Reduce poverty. Slow population growth. And create better sustainable farming practices will all be ways to help prevent global warming. Once it's happened, how do you clean those things up? Well, you can remove the CO2 after you've burned it, but before it gets in the atmosphere. You can sequester and store it by planting more trees. You can inject it deep underground and hope there's no leaks for it to come back out. You can sequester CO2 in the form of cropland and other non-till agricultural practices. You could try to sequester CO2 down deep in ocean beds. You can repair leaky natural gas pipes. You can use animal feeds to reduce the emissions from cows. All of these things are ways that you could help do it afterwards. And you see that most of them involve CO2 and how we're handling that, but some of it involves methane. Case study, capturing and storing CO2. So carbon sequestration, sequestering carbon. What are ways where we could do it? Well, we need to find places to store it, right? Absorb it and store it in places. So this picture here shows some of those things. Tree plantations will absorb it. Crop fields can absorb it. So here's an example of a coal power plant where we've taken the CO2, not emitted much in the atmosphere. Instead, we're pumping it or putting it out into these specific locations, switchgrass, for instance. You could dig wells and pump it down into old coal bed seams, or spent oil and natural gas reservoirs, or deep into saltwater reservoirs in the ground. And so these are ways of trying to put the CO2 into places where it can't get into the atmosphere. How do we prepare people for these long-term harmful effects of climate change? Well, you got to stop letting people build right on the coast. So we have to make some regulations to change the way that those things are done. You got to move people from low-lying coastal areas inward and promote that movement in some way. You got to start using less water and develop crops that need less water. You got to start creating reserves and corridors for animals to get around and move from one location to another, so we don't have habitat fragmentation causing problems with migrations. You got to build up stock supplies of food. You got to have hazardous waste stored away from the coasts. And then we need to move our wildlife reserves further towards the poles. All of these things would help us prepare for climate change. And then the main way you could affect or reduce the threats to climate change have to come from governmental things. So a program to slow and adapt global warming. It's going to cost less than trying to deal with the problems afterwards. So governments can do things like tax greenhouse emissions and energy usage. They can create subsidies and tax breaks to save energy. They could decrease the subsidies and tax breaks for fossil fuels, for instance. They could get other countries to agree to reduce their emissions as well, but this can be a really challenging thing. And the United States isn't immune to making this a difficult situation. Let's talk about the Kyoto Protocol. So this happened in 1997. A bunch of delegates from a bunch of countries, 161, met in Kyoto, Japan, to negotiate how to handle global warming stuff. And this protocol officially went into effect in 2005, January. And it basically required the 38 participants who agreed to do it, that were all developed countries, to cut their CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide down to the levels they were before, below what they were in the 1990s. So cut them back across the board. And so this basically was going to result in this reduction of about 29% of all the emissions on the planet. And then the protocol also implemented a cap and trade program where you could only create so many of these gases to put in the atmosphere, and we were only going to allow so much. And if you didn't use them all, you could trade them and sell them to other countries and kind of work out a system so there's only a certain amount that goes in the atmosphere. By the way, developing countries were not included as part of this protocol. It was just developed countries. So, during this process, 191 countries signed and ratified the protocol and jumped on board. Just so you know, the U.S. did not. This didn't happen. Political reasons, people weren't interested in reducing greenhouse emissions during that time. Developing countries such as China and India and Brazil weren't part of it either. So if you take the U.S., China, and India and Brazil out of the equation, that's not going to create a lot of reduction in greenhouse gases because we're the countries that produce the most. And the U.S. didn't sign it because they thought there was a potential harm to the U.S. economy as a result of signing it, so they stayed out of it. But even though they stayed out of it, 10 U.S. states and 740 U.S. cities are participating in the protocols, even though the government isn't. But a lot of people would argue that the protocol will have very little actual global warming effect without the support of the U.S., China, and India because we're such big producers. Carbon footprints, we've talked about that, and we've measured that already for ourselves. So reducing your carbon footprint is an important part of solving this problem. If you get to the point where you're carbon neutral, which means there's a balance between the amount of carbon you're releasing in the atmosphere and the amount you're removing from the atmosphere, if you get to that point, that would go a long way to solving a lot of those problems. And so a lot of people are taking initiatives and trying to solve that on their own within the United States, not as a whole government, but as components.